The general outline that I have here, and I'll give that to you first so that you can see where I'm going, is I want to touch on some of the highlights of the theology of marriage and what it means. Then what I want to do is to go into the notion of what healing in the church is all about, just a general overview. Then I want to talk about the necessity of how that we use our human reason in order to aid healing, which is part of the tradition of the church. And that means using science. And then to go into the science of psychology regarding aspects of marriage that would be unhelpful or helpful. And then when we get to the parenting section, we would do the same thing in terms of parenting. All right. So you see here then the first. So you see there that marriage is an exalted vocation, as the Apostle Paul taught. It replicates the relationship between Christ and the church. Have we come across that anywhere? Does anyone remember St. Paul talking about that? Do you want to elaborate a little bit? See, I want a little interaction with people. When does St. Paul talk about this?
He explains marriage as Christ is the head of the church, the husband the head of the household.
From the epistle to the Ephesians, right? Which is what we say during the marriage ceremony, okay? And we'll have a little example of that after, all right? So that's how exalted the marriage vocation is. The marriage vocation actually is an icon, if you wish, or a replication of Christ's own commitment to his church. And that's how we can think about the marital relationship, okay? Now, I use the word ordination. It's not a bad word. In the blessed marriage in the Orthodox Church, maybe I can just hold this and start to talk at the same time. In a blessed marriage in the Orthodox Church, the couple is ordained as leaders of the domestic church. Now, have you ever heard the term domestic church before? Well, little church in the home. Domestic church or little church in the home. Actually, St. John Chrysostom talks about that. So it goes back right to the first millennium of our tradition. All right? That the home, in a sense, is replicating the body of Christ itself. And so it's the husband and wife, which are by their marriage consecrated to lead their home together. Now, what do you think of that? Any comments about that? Anything resonate with you in terms of that notion? Does that sort of exalt the marital relationship? Does it downplay the marital relationship?
It's a bigger responsibility on the parents. You're entrusted to building your own church within your home.
It's a bigger responsibility. You're entrusted to build your own church in the home. It's an unbelievable responsibility. So if you really take the marital, and if you read the prayers, they're really beautiful. If you take time to read the prayers of the marital service, you see how very deep and spiritually meaningful they actually are. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of enlivening the marital relationship of your own domestic church. That you're enlivened by Christ. You're enlivened by the real meaning of what it is to be married together, and so on. And of course, you see the word king and queen, and they're granted the grace. And by the way, I put in quotes, fair education of children, because one of the last prayers in the marital service is that this does take place for the fair education of children. So you see that there's an assembly. You know, the word church does not really mean building. Building is really, this is a temple, a structure here. The church are the people. Okay, it's the assembly. That's the real meaning of the word church. So if we think about that, we can think that you live in a home or an apartment, right? That's a structure. but it is your family, it is the assembly in Christ that makes up the queen, and the children that live and enlivened by Christ, that makes up what the domestic church is all about.
Father, what does fair education refer to?
Fair education, well, it's a dated phrase for the good, enlightenment education. Fair education would be fair being good, okay? Our translation in our service book is quote a little Old English, okay, which I've learned and memorized, okay, and so on. Like, for example, when we say, and Father Anthony always uses the current word, but I have it so memorized in the creed where we say for the living and the dead. And he said, and Father Anthony says the living and the dead. I say the quick and the dead because that's how I have it memorized. If I start to change the things, I get all lost and everything like that, okay? I guess we'll update the service book at some point, Father Anthony, it's being done someplace.
I hope so, because especially with the creed, there's also another one that's really important, which is, and was made man. We say he's begotten, not made, and then later on we say he was made man. It should be and became man. That's another one that I use that should be changed.
Yeah, yeah. All right, now, we speak about the crowning or the agape service. Does anyone know what the crowning actually, the crowning means? Before you read actually the, I think I have it there. Yeah, I do have it, but did anyone know what the crowning actually refers to?
Establishes a man as the head of the house.
Well, you can think that it's a king and queen, but it also means a martyrdom, all right? If you see here, we become one flesh. When we speak about becoming one flesh, it's an act of agape. Agape is another word for love. Now, does anyone know the different words for love that we have? It's much easier in Greek. Yes?
It's agape versus eros, right?
There's eros, yes, okay, which is the sensual or sexual aspect, all right? There's another word besides that. Okay, there's a third word that we have. Yes. And what does that mean? Brotherly, philios, it means liking or brotherly or something like that, all right? So it's a lover of, for example, we use the word philosophy, okay? Lover of wisdom. Sophistry is wisdom, sophos, and phil being lover of, okay? So we have three words that mean love, but the highest form of love is agape, all right? So you can think of something that you like. You can think of something like, you would like ice cream, a Philios ice cream. You might think of something that you can think of a sensual love, okay, in terms of eros. And we can think of agape, which is actually the highest form of love, and it's a selfless giving of self to the other. Selfless giving. In other words, without anything coming to you, you give to the other. Now, the answer is right in front of you, but who's our model for this? Christ. What did Christ get out of, in any manner, shape, or form, giving himself to us? Nothing. He got nothing out of it for himself. Okay? And it was really for us that he did that. That he took upon our human nature. He became incarnate. That's the word we use. Incarnate, taking on our human nature. That he lived his life. That he taught and gave us the words of his Father. And we just had the theophany, right? That in the Jordan he's baptized and the Trinity was manifest over him. Okay? And God called him his beloved son. So we see that out of this, he did this for us. Yet alone, going and had his suffering on the cross and eventually conquering sin and death for us. So if we think of the depth of what Christ did, this is the depth that we are to have in terms of the marital service. And the crowning usually means a martyrdom, because in some way we are giving up our own selves for our spouses. All right? And that's actually what is meant there. Okay? So, as Christ did, you have to be willing to give up your life for your spouse. Any questions at all? Please raise your hand if you have any questions or want to say something. And don't forget to take notes, okay, if something's meaningful to you in some way. Please. All right. Now, here is the excerpt from St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, which I've read. And you can read it. Being subject to one another in fear of Christ, let women be subject to their husbands as to the Lord. Now, fundamentalist Christians make a real big deal out of that particular phrase, where the husband is the king and can literally rule like a dictator, an autocrat, or something like that over their spouse. But let's continue reading, and this is really important. Okay? Of course, then St. Paul talks about as Christ is the head of the church, the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives be subject to the husbands in all things. Now, St. Paul is writing in a particular culture. The culture was a patristic culture. It was male-oriented, and so on and so forth. However, the Holy Spirit does come out here and does point something very, very important, which is coming up in the following phrase. Husbands, love your wives, okay, as Christ also loved the church and delivered himself up for it. Now, here is the really, I think, one of the most important phrases in this entire epistle passage. So also ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. Now I put down an interpretation, but what do you get from that? Just when you think about that, what do you think of? What do you think about that?
I don't think it was just a culture thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think God in the beginning He wanted the woman to follow the man away, just like the church followed Jesus. I don't think it's just a culture.
It's not just a cultural thing. That's one possibility, okay? And that's what I think a very fundamentalist way of looking at things would be. However, let's take this one passage very seriously for a moment. So also ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself.
So, the way I think it is that as husband and wife should be one body in a way. So basically, by the husband loving the wife, he's loving himself. So because they're both as one.
So if his wife, all right, so the husband regards his wife's way of regarding situations or topics as his own. All right, now I make this a little bit clearer in the next slide. All right, if you love and value your wife as you do your own, that means you value what? The attitudes, feelings, values, viewpoints of each spouse are respected by the other. Each works toward understanding the other and then reaching a consensus. Does that make sense in some way? So if you take seriously that you value your wife as yourself, that means you value her opinions as you do your own opinions. You regard her way of looking at things as you do yours. And then together, as king and queen of the domestic church, you come up with some type of answer to whatever it is that you happen to be looking at, and so on and so forth. So rather than having being something that is authoritarian, it now becomes something that is consensual, that is both working together in concert, like a beautiful symphony or something like that. And I think this is something that is not really emphasized as much as we really should in our understanding of the relationship of the husband and wife to each other. And I think that sometimes conflicts come out because of that, because one person wants to dominate over the other. Instead of taking that one phrase so seriously, let me go back again, right? So also ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. So therefore, you value what your wife, the attitudes and feelings and values that your wife has as much as yourself. Now, St. Paul here is talking really to, husbands and so on. But I think it's important to keep that in mind. Any other ideas about this? Anyone want to make any comments? Or anyone? Yes?
I just wanted to bring up that it's a reciprocal thing.
There's a reciprocity, yes, that's a very good way of looking at it. It's a reciprocity, yes. And then you come to some type of common understanding and so on and so forth. And from a psychological viewpoint, which we'll get into later, that's actually the best way of bringing about, a functional family. Okay, because if there's discord between husband and wife, father and mother, then there'll be discord among their children, and so on. So not only is this spiritually on target, but we'll see that it's actually psychologically on target as well, in terms of the intricacies and the specifics of bringing about either solving a family problem or dealing with family problems and encouraging appropriate behavior on the part of the children, against children, and so on and so forth. Okay? Any questions at all? Okay. Now one flesh again, for this cause shall man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The marital relationship, two individuals become one flesh, a term that means two individuals to work in concert. We sort of covered this already, didn't we just say that? To become one in mind and heart. And they are joined together in love in a way that replicates the three persons of the Trinity in terms of the relationship of the persons of the Trinity to one another. So not only is it in terms of the relationship of Christ to the church, but it also is is a Trinitarian aspect of this also. How the persons of the Trinity relate to one another. So there's a very deep theological ethos, so to speak, spirit to marriage. And that's something that really we should meditate on. And I think it's important for couples before they get married to meditate on. And even for couples to enliven their marriage as they go through life and so on. Okay? It's Christocentric. And it's also Trinitarian in terms of agape, that selfless love that they have for one another. And they become one flesh. And if you think of the idea of becoming one flesh, you can think of the the sexual union that will take place. But also you can think of the idea that out of that union will come a child that will have the flesh of both mother and father. So that there's a richness to that notion of becoming of one flesh. Any questions? Or anything? Yes?
When you started, you said 3 unholy
Impediments.
Yeah. I'm not clear on that. What are the 3?
Oh, we're not there yet. That's at the end.
Okay.
We may not even get to that today. We may, okay,
That's fine.
all right. Entitlement, reciprocity, and naming. That's the 3. We'll get there, okay? Those 3 impediments are, it's based on some research that I had done with a psychiatrist at the University of Pennsylvania, where we did a study on marital satisfaction and discord, and these were the 3 major, what we call factors, when we did a factor analysis, a statistical analysis of the data. And that's why I put the 3 unholy. Actually, it came up with 32. So if you want other talks, we can go beyond those 3 to another 29, okay? But those were the major ones, the 3 major ones, all right? And, but we'll get there. They're in the back of your sheet here, okay? Becoming one flesh in a blessed marriage is an act of agape, a selfless giving, a self-emptying. In Greek, we use the word kenosis. A manner like when Christ took on human flesh and assumed the nature of mankind. We talked about that. Crowning in the Orthodox service, the crowning of the couple references martyrdom. We also mentioned that before, so I don't want to go over it again. Except if you have a question. Now, psycho-spiritual obstacle. Now we'll bring in here just a little bit of both a psychological aspect and a spiritual aspect. Self-centered marriage is a marriage in name only. After the fall, we are predisposed to self-centered choices. And we're directed by our passions. Now, if you look at the little red book from our archdiocese, or if you may come across it someplace else, you hear about the 7 deadly sins. Pride, lust, greed, etc. Those actually are not sins in and of themselves. They're actually temptations. They're actually predispositions to sin. So, if we make a choice that's based upon these predispositions that we have, then what we're doing is that in fact we are sinning instead of this consensual, selfless back and forth that we talked about that a marriage should have. Okay? So St. Isaac of Syria tells us, and by the way, we have the feast of St. Isaac of Syria tomorrow, as well as St. Ephrem of Syria. And in the bulletin, I put in a couple little references to St. Isaac of Syria and St. Ephrem of Syria. Which is interesting that it comes up right here the day before his feast day. Pandering to the flesh produces in us shameful urges and unseemly fantasies. And I give the reference where that comes from, our early fathers from Philadelphia. So the brokenness of mankind, the lack of understanding. Now the lack of understanding here, what we mean by this is when we don't use our reasoning ability or our rationality, and this will be the psychology section of when we get there, okay? So when we don't reason correctly, when we are irrational in our thinking processes, then what happens is that this breaks down the marital relationship. So if we are enlivened by Christ to keep the ethos or the spirit of what a marriage should be, and this can motivate us then to maximize our thinking processes and our reasoning processes and our rationality to make things better, okay? And try to deal with the brokenness that mankind has. So, the brokenness of mankind, lack of understanding, reasoning, rationality, self-centeredness, and the passions may predispose a couple to discord. And that's something that we want to work on overcoming. And we want to do that as Christians and as the fact that we're created by God and been given reason. And reason means that we can try to do everything that we can to understand ourselves and the world around us in order to make things better in some way. St. John Chrysostom on marriage. Adopt the spirit of St. John Chrysostom when he speaks on marriage that both husbands and wives would say to one another. And this is a beautiful little quote that I just put here. I value your love above all things, and nothing would be so bitter or painful to me as our being at odds with each other. And this is St. John Chrysostom's homily 20:20 on Ephesians 5. By the way, there's a little book, I meant to bring it in and I forgot, on marriage and family life. Have anyone seen that book? It's a little book, maybe we can get it for our bookstore. It's a little thin book on marriage and family life, and he talks about the domestic church, like I mentioned before, as well as other topics in marriage. And it's very, very useful sometimes for a couple to look over, individuals to look over, and so on. The lessons from Ephesians, to summarize this a little bit. The path of a righteous marriage before God is when it is lived as conjoined, as a conjoined duality, reigning over the domestic church. Not a singularity, not a single person, but a duality in consensus over the domestic church. So, kingship and queenship, mainly leading by example. And here, modeling is most effective. And living out the royal priesthood according to law at our holy baptism and chrismation. Let me mention modeling here for a moment. I'm just going to throw something psychological in. Years ago, when I was back in New Jersey, and I had a counseling center. By the way, I had icons all around, and I was always dressed in clericals and so on. And I would have, let's say, a husband, mother, father come in, and this is a concrete example that I'll give you. I had a mother come in. Let me take one example. A mother come in. She would sit down, on a couch, and I'd be sitting in a chair across from me. And I would say, why are you here, and so on. She would say, well, it's because my child is smoking. Okay, the child is smoking. He shouldn't smoke. I don't want him to smoke. Okay. And when you look down on the side of where she was sitting is her pocketbook. Sticking up of the pocketbook are a pack of cigarettes. I see people smiling. And I'd say, and this is exactly what I say, do you think I'm a miracle worker? I said, look what you have in your pocketbook. You're a child, yes, but I can smoke, but they can't. I said, you know how many children are going to be able to believe that? 0. Nobody. Impossible. It doesn't work. If you smoke, they're going to smoke. There's no different set of rules between the parent and the child. The only time you could get away with that is when there's a law, and you could always make reference to the law that's written, the legal system, a state law, or city law, or federal law, and say, well, by federal law, by city law, by state law, this cannot be done. You can't purchase alcohol until you're 21, or something like that. So while mom and dad will have, a cocktail, this is not something that, you can do because the law states you can't do it. But it's not so much modeling. Of course, if you're sitting down getting totally drunk, that's totally different once again, okay? But modeling, in fact, I can't tell you the number of psychological studies that have shown that modeling is one of the most important teachers of children. You learn just by observation. It's called observational learning. And during the parenting 101 section, if we ever get there, you'll see how absolutely, totally important that is. With simply seeing something once, a child will learn it, and so on. So keep that in mind.
So that is a big challenge because we do have a drink in front of our kids and they see us drinking a beer and they're going to want to try it. But the only way I tell our kids is the law. Like you said, there's a law that says you can't drink before 21, and you explain that to them. So there's many other things that don't have a law that we have to make up the law, like you're saying. So that's the only way to do things. And they see you doing it, but you have to explain you can do it after this age. But the right thing is if they pass a certain age point, they're not going to get addicted to something if they start in early stage than if they start in a later stage. And those studies have shown that. So if they start smoking after 21 or 25, they're probably not going to get addicted as if they start smoking.
Then they start early.
At 15
Yeah, that's true. Now, growing up in the family that I did, at Sunday, we would have like a little wine, and they would give me a little bit of wine watered down. And, while the adults would have, a glass of wine, they would give the children, like a little bit of wine. So it was sort of a family dinner type of thing. And so you were not introduced to it as it was sort of a family experience. And you sort of got the idea that it was age appropriate for you to be able to do that and so on. So, but it's very complicated, okay? And I can even give you other examples, where a parent came into me and said, my child is smoking pot. And it took me a whole session, one whole session to ask this question, and I did it as they were leaving. I said to the mother, I said, gee, where do you think the child is getting it from? From me. They go into my top drawer in my bedroom. So after almost picking myself off the floor, I said to myself, well, I guess I should have asked this question a little earlier, Now, of course, it's much, it's everywhere, school systems and, kids are selling it to other, and worse than pot, too. And of course, now pot is legal, and so on. But the point is that, if you're modeling that behavior yourself, so I can't tell you how important, I know this is part of the theology section, but I just wanted to throw in this notion that modeling is really, really critical, okay? I recently I was speaking to someone, an Orthodox family, and this is just within the past year. And the child that I was talking to was throwing out a lot of 4-letter words. And supposedly this family was very, very committed to the church and they'll tell you they were not in our diocese or not in this area. So don't think this diocese or this area, okay? And the child said to me, actually a young man, said to me, Father, I guess you're wondering why I keep using words like this. Maybe I should be ashamed of myself. I said, well, you know, you do have a rich vocabulary there and so on. And he said, well, this is the way my parents talk all the time. This is how we talk, everyone in the household. My father and my mother talk like this, using these 4-letter words all the time. And they were held a very high level in a lay group within their jurisdiction. And very professional, quote, people, both of them. Professional parents, professional people. And yet, so you wonder where the children get this from, and how they have a son and a daughter. All right? So, yes?
I'm perplexed. I tell you why.
You're what?
Perplexed about the statement. So the reason why, there was a report actually that I was stunned to see from Good Morning America. Parents or parents who use those 4-letter words show sign of intelligence. And I'm really shocked at that statement. I was shocked at that statement. So to me, you know, how could that report be out saying that people who use profanity and use those 4-letter words are very intelligent, and that's on national television. And then when a child hears that, they say, you know what, let me mimic what that report is saying. Maybe it will show a sign of intelligence. So I hear you. However, our society is giving us a different message. It's giving our children a different message. And to me, Good Morning America is a family show. When a psychologist go up on television and say, hey, listen, this is a sign of intelligence, and the children hear that, it is difficult.
Well, first, as a researcher, clinical psychologist myself, I would want to know the study that was done.
Right.
And I would want to look at the study and see whether or not there's whether this is a real, well, you know, it's many times things are whole studies, but the studies are flawed in some way. So I would want to make sure that the study is a reputable study, it's replicable. There are certain standards that we have for scientific studies. I'll give you a smattering of it later. It comes up in your little thing. You have to be able to replicate the study with random samples, statistical procedures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Anyone can put together a bad study.
And Father,
However,
yeah.
that being as it may, the point about society and, you know, the lyrics and some of these, you know, songs, and, you know, when you see mainstream television, which I really don't watch, but the smattering that I do come across, you know, versus when I was a child, it's like day and night. I mean, the things that are acceptable now would never have been acceptable when I was a child. And so it becomes mainstream. And you know, and it's not cool if you don't accept all of that. So we are fighting a cultural fight. There's no doubt about it. In fact, interestingly, while not directly touching on this, just yesterday I read a study. Barna, I don't know if you know the Barna Group, B-A-R-N-A. They do survey research. They have a very good reputation. And apparently, in this current generation of children that we have now, commitment to, there is a much higher level of atheism and commitment to church, and because of the culture. That's really what it boils down to. I can send you the report if you want to look at it.
Yeah, but
That's the, you know, that's the gist of it. All right, so picking up now, we'll probably go until about 12:30, okay, because we started late, all right? And we're only on slide 10 of 67, so so we'll go moseying along here now. Okay, I made reference before to the royal priesthood. The royal priesthood is something that comes with us at baptism. And we can think about it, you know, how a child puts on the baptismal robe, and we put on Christ. And during the Paschal season, we use that phrase, to put on Christ. So all of us are part of the royal priesthood of Christ. And so that's another way of looking at the domestic church. That you're exercising not only the kingship and queenship that are ordained for your home, but also you're exercising the royal priesthood in the domestic church, a little church in the home. And here you see the scriptural passage, salute Prisca and Aquila, my helpers in Christ Jesus, and the church which is in their house, from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. And then St. John Chrysostom, as I mentioned, preached about, quote, the small church, the church in the home. Ensures the health and stability of the family and raising children. Obviously, raising children, that's the fair education we talked about before, pointing to Christ for their becoming one with Christ. However, we know that there is the work of the evil one. The evil one is the separator, the source of disorder. The devil functions as a liar, destroyer, and separator, as one who distorts God's truth and violently deconstructs God's created order. Remember, we were originally in paradise. We were originally meant for paradise. And then after the fall, we then inherited brokenness, distorted thinking, distorted inclinations. That's what a passion is. It's an inclination. Remember the 7 deadly sins? It really should be called the 7 deadly inclinations. Okay, then we can then make a choice dependent upon them. And that becomes the sin. But we're inclined to that brokenness. And that's the work that the separator does. And Jesus told the Pharisees, and this is from St. John, as you see the reference there, you are the father of the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. So I just wanted to remind us that while we have Christ, we also have the evil one. And that's why I have this slide there. Now, interestingly, we know from the Holy Gospels that, in fact, possession can take place. We have the Gospel accounts of individuals who have been possessed by evil ones, by demons, and then Jesus casting the demons out. And every now and then we hear of it in our contemporary society where someone is really possessed. However, most of the time, I would almost say 99.9% of the time, the evil one does his work through our own human frailty, our own human brokenness. And this was picked up by a British author, a Christian, an Anglican, during World War II. How many of you have read the Screwtape Letters? 1, 2, 3. When I was in the monastery, we had silence all the time, certainly during the meals. This is where I first came across the Screwtape Letters and C.S. Lewis. And this was read to us. And since then, I have just been so taken by it. Because I see C.S. Lewis tells you, let me just give you a little bit of what we have here. The point of C.S. Lewis's book on the Screwtape Letters is that the evil one uses deception, deceit, and camouflage, okay? And the gist of the story is that there's a senior supervising devil, and he tells the devil novice, and this is a quote, "Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. If your patient can't be kept out of the church, he ought at least to be violently attached to some party within it." In other words, division. You know how there are little cliques, and I hate to say this, but it's true, maybe even in here, in our parish, there are little cliques. So sometimes we become more attached to a clique than to Christ and the full assembly. And certainly in society, we have the subdivisions within society that we talked about, the culture, the subcultures that make up different parts of our contemporary society. And we use that to separate ourselves from one another. He ought to be violently attached to some party within it. I don't mean on really doctrinal issues. About those, the more lukewarm he is, the better. One church is as good as another, or one person's opinion is as good as another, or something like that. In other words, sort of a laissez-faire, let everyone live, etc., etc. And it isn't the doctrines on which we chiefly depend for producing malice. The real fun is working up hatred between parties. So once again, what he's really talking about here is using our foibles, using our natural broken inclinations to separate us from one another and to separate us from Christ. Applying this to the family in a marriage, to separate a husband and wife from one another, the children from the parents, etc., etc., and people from the church, the assembly. With brilliant insight, Lewis pens the words of the senior devil on how the evil one wants Christianity to be used. Certainly, we do not want Christianity to flow over into their political life. We do not want men to treat Christianity as a means to their own advancement. You see the little rift? Believe this, not because it is true, but for some other reason. That's the game. So in other words, you try to get people to believe in the way they're looking at it for different reasons that they have, that they can personalize and so on. Any questions about that? Now, Christ, however, is the healer. One little icon I put in this PowerPoint presentation. Okay? And the church is a hospital and not a courtroom for souls. She does not condemn on the behalf of sins, but grants remission of sins. Healing, in other words. Now, healing in Byzantium. I mentioned very briefly at the beginning of what I said. I'd give you a quick overview of the first minute or so of today's presentation, that I made reference to healing in the first millennium. In the healing in Byzantium, in the 4th century, various healing centers were opened and administered by the Orthodox Church, including homes for the poor, orphans, aged, and hospitals. Did anyone know this here? Anyone know we actually had monastery hospitals in the first 1,000 years of this part of the church? And you know, they had healthcare workers and physicians, nurses, and the psychologists of the day that were employed and used by the monks. And you know, two of the major saints, although I have one here, I'll make reference to the other one in a moment. St. Basil of Caesarea was trained in medicine, and he was one of the ones who founded one of these monastery hospitals. Another monastery hospital was founded by St. John Chrysostom, and he used the wealth of the church to open these hospitals, and he earned great love from his people. And there were a couple centuries in which there was a rapid growth. And Emperor Justinian moved the most important physicians into the hospitals, which enhanced the reputation. I have a couple references there if you're interested in this. I have an article that I've written. I have Dr. John Demakis, who is a very good friend of mine, who wrote a book on this. And I can't tell you how important this actually is to understand the role of healing within the church, because this is what we're meant to do, to heal, because of the brokenness that we are inclined to. So if you notice how we started out by looking at marriage in terms of being enlivened by Christ, in imitation of the Trinity and the love that Christ has for us and the Trinity has for one another, and then the role of the husband and wife, father and mother in the home, and then of course there's the demon that's now going to try to break this down, and however we have the church that is now going to be a hospital for us to help us overcome some of these problems. And notice that the church does not just include the holy mysteries of the church, although it certainly does include that. That's critical. It also includes the adjunctive areas, such as, for example, the hospitals that were set up. I think Father Anthony wants to tell me something. Yes,
No, I just want to say, I have to go because I'm expected in a home. But before I leave, I wanted to thank Father George for this wonderful presentation. I hope you guys are being edified by it and getting something from it, because it is a deeply spiritual and very enlightening perspective on marriage and family and raising up children and all of that. And the only thing I want to say is I hope and pray that you will continue to come to these, because he's going to continue them. You know, it's like a series of seminars, and you'll get the full benefit of them if you continue to come to them as he continues on. Thank you, Father, very much. God bless you. Continue on.
Thank you. At the top of their class, academically, now realize this is the 3rd and 4th century, but still, they had to be at the top of their class. They also had to be extremely spiritual people. They had to be people of prayer. They had to attribute their success to God. So there was a combination of both a spiritual element and a very, very strong academic element here. And I am very, very committed. I always have been. Maybe that's why I'm so attracted to this, because I feel very attracted to both the depth of spirituality and also the rigor of the academic requirements for those who do this kind of work, the work of healing. And it would also go to people who write studies, the rigor of people who write studies. Okay. Father Stanley Harrigus. Anyone know Father Stanley Harrigus? Father Stanley Harrigus was a professor. He's still alive, I believe. Once again, another friend of mine. I knew him from Holy Cross. He was a professor of ethics. He was on the Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops Ethics Committee, which I was at the same time. And many times we would go over different issues and so on and so forth. And he's an outstanding, not only a very humble servant of God and priest, but really brilliant and outstanding in his area, his field. And anyhow, this is a little phrase he says about healing. Medical treatment is also seen as human cooperation with God's healing purposes and goals. See, what I'm trying to do here is to justify what I'm going to bring in the psychology section, that it's very, very important. It's not tangential. It's not just something that, oh yeah, psychology's over there and we'll use it. It's actually critical. When our Lord said, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, to have dominion, when God told at creation to have dominion over the world, he meant for us to use the gifts that he gave us, which include reasoning, which means that we are impelled to use the best of our reasoning. And we know that, for example, science is a way of knowing the world, and then applying this clinically, along with being enlivened by Christ. So there's a synergy, a whole interworking relationship between all these factors. And that's what the point I'm trying to make here. Medical treatment is also seen as a human cooperation with God's healing purposes and goals. In fact, all Orthodox teaching recognizes a place for human effort, striving, and cooperation with God's will, technically known as synergy, synergy. This belief requires the exercise of human talents and abilities for salvation, for spiritual growth, for moral behavior, for achievement of human potential. Let me put in here, for achieving and maximizing the potential of every marriage and every family. So in principle, the use of healing medicines, even surgical procedures, have generally been understood throughout history of the church to be appropriate, fitting, and desirable ways of cooperating with God in the healing of human illnesses. Which, I think you all know this, which evangelist was a physician? St. Luke. And we have a whole history of the unmercenary physicians, the physicians within the church, St. Cosmas and Damien, for example, and so on. Okay? So besides this example, we have those examples as well. God's creation and his Lord's. The intellect must be applied in the contemplation of life around us. Where does the ultimate meaning of creation and our place in it come from? Science or God? Anyone care to speculate on that? Where does meaning come from? Because if you read on here, you'll sort of see the answer, but make believe you're not reading on. All right, let me continue reading and then we'll see what you might say about it. Science is empirical. It measures material objects and defines material processes. It describes the works or working of creation. That's what the word empirical means. Empirical means something that can be seen and measured and described and worked on, and you're going to apply a mathematical formula to it, etc., etc. Okay? But it can say nothing about the meaning of creation. Materiality and meaning are two separate things. Are there any questions? Because I know I'm getting a little philosophical here on this one. Okay? You're all right with this? So far, okay. Now, the meaning of creation. I've given you a couple selections here from Psalm 18, 1:8. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. That's in terms of the meaning of creation. God is love. When we speak about the concepts of beauty, love, and purpose, You'll find these throughout the Divine Liturgy, for example. You'll find these in our services, in our prayers. In other words, it's a sense that we have of the overall meaning. Like if you go to the Grand Canyon, you have a sense of awe. You have a sense of, there must, and I've heard people say this to me, there must, and I've been to the Grand Canyon, have the same reaction myself. Has anyone here been to the, let me ask you, have you ever been here? Yeah. When you were there, what did you feel? Did you see, what did you sense?
Just for me, it was the
Say again?
enormity of God's creation.
The greatness of God. I've heard people say to me, oh, there must be a God. Just looking at it, in other words, the majesty of it, that there must be something which gives meaning to this whole thing, which is above and beyond everything that can be seen in some way. So that's the notion of meaning. And that's something that's what we get from our understanding of God and Christ and so on. What is science? Since the rules that govern the world are written into the very fabric of creation and discerned by the faculty of reasoning, the atheist, agnostic, or those committed to Christ and God can discover what they are. Uncovering them is not dependent on whether one believes in God. You see, the cosmos is created by God. The laws of, I'm going to use the word cosmos, or the entire universe, are laws that are created by God. When we study those laws, we're studying the laws that God created in terms of making the universe. That's all we're doing. Now, we're part of the universe. We're creatures, and we have our own laws that govern our human interaction with one another, either individually or in concert one with another, in families, among parents and children, husbands, wives, among friends, among colleagues, among boss and employees, among strangers, etc., among groups, different groups of people. So there are certain laws that govern the interaction of everything in the universe. These are part of the laws that God created. And as scientists, whether we are astrophysicists or in the area of behavioral science, we can look and determine and understand these particular laws. And then hopefully we can use them for our betterment. Not only for our sanctification, but also to enhance ourselves here on earth as a family, and individually, and so on. Reason versus spiritual knowledge. The fathers of the church taught us that there are two types of knowing that for our purposes can be called reason, and then there's a high-class word here, noetic. Reason is the ground of scientific knowledge. That's what I mentioned before. It builds systems and processes and possesses an integrity that conforms to man's, I'll use the word intellect in this case, but it's really reason. Noetic knowledge is the knowledge comprehended through concrete encounter with God. This concrete encounter, that's why I said, if you go to the Grand Canyon, that's one of my favorite songs. I don't know about you, we all have, I'm sure, a favorite song, but the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day pours out the word today, and night to night God's knowledge. It's a sense of the presence of God in his creation, that there has to be a God that created something like this. It might be someone who hears a piece of music. It might be someone who looks at a flower. It might be someone who can look at something in creation and realize that there's a transcendent God above that. That's really the notion of what noetic means. So we have that type of knowledge, but we also have knowledge that we can gain through looking at the way the world works, whether it's the cosmic world, the world of astronomy and so on and so forth, or the world of human interaction, or biology. All right, so we have the whole gamut from the biggest picture on a cosmic level down to a microscopic level. And I have once again a source for that. The scientific method. The scientific method today is usually agreed upon the following procedures. Observations. Observations are defined by the procedures used in measuring or assessing a subject. Intelligence of an individual is defined operationally by the score on a valid and reliable intelligence test. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means something like this. Michael before mentioned that today, that show today or something?
Good Morning America.
Good Morning America, or whatever. Thank you. Obviously, I don't listen to it. Good Morning America. And so here, there is a, people who use these four-letter words are people that are intelligent. See, I would want to look at that study, and I would really want to see whether or not how they got their sample, how, how they measured it, and so on and so forth. I would want to break that study down and see whether or not it's actually a very, very good study or not. That's what I would want to do, all right? When we use the word intelligence, there has to be an intelligence test in some way. That test has to be what we call valid, and it has to be reliable. Now, validity means that it measures what it is supposed to measure. So if I say an intelligence test is the ability to pick this piece of paper up, what does that have to do with intelligence? On the other hand, reliability is that it's consistent, that it's the same way over time. If I have a ruler, and the ruler is made out of rubber, and I'm measuring something in the summertime, and I measure something and I stretch out the ruler, well, it's going to be much longer than if I do it in the wintertime where things shrink. So this rubber ruler, is it reliable? No, it's not reliable. So there are certain measurements that we have that have to, quote, certain processes that we have to measure up, so to speak, in order to conform to the standards of science. And this has changed over time. When I was in graduate school, for example, it was enough to do one study and have it, what we call, replicated, have a second study done that followed the procedures of the first study to make sure that it would come out the same way. Now, there's a new statistical procedure called meta-analysis, where we look at hundreds of studies and look at the mathematics behind all of the studies taken together. So that's an advancement in our statistical understanding of different studies. Now, we're not here to study statistics or anything like that. I'm just trying to give you an example of the exactitude that we have in looking at knowing the world around us from a scientific point of view. We also have the word hypothesis. Hypotheses are assumptions or guesses. Very frequently people confuse the word hypothesis with the word fact. They have a guess about something and they think it's a fact, when in fact it may not be. Okay? It's simply that they think it might be. There might be a relationship. They might even feel that it's a relationship. That's called emotional reasoning. That's a cognitive distortion. I'm jumping really ahead here. That's one of the brokennesses that we get from our ancestral parents. Cognitive distortions, emotional reasoning. I feel something, therefore it is. Not true. Feelings are not facts. So no matter how strongly you feel about something, doesn't make it true. So a hypothesis simply you guess about something. That's all it means. And then falsifiability. A hypothesis must be falsifiable, meaning that it cannot predict everything. If I have a theory of weather, and my theory of weather says today the wind speed will be anywhere between 0 and 300 miles an hour, the temperature will be anywhere between minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And the precipitation will either be between 0 and torrential rain. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. Is it a good theory?
No.
It's not falsifiable. There's nowhere on earth you can falsify that theory. Okay? It's meaningless. So a theory you have to make a specific prediction. So if I make a prediction that today temperature will be between, let's say, 70 and 71, and we'll have 5-mile-an-hour winds, is that falsifiable? Sure, because if it's 90 and we have 20-mile-an-hour winds, obviously something wrong with my theory. Okay? So you can see that it has to be so specific. Cognitive psychology and ancient practices. Cognitive psychologists use their own technical vocabulary and have demonstrated empirical evidence for such processes. Now that's the science that we talked about before. The automaticity of irrational thoughts leads to dysfunctional emotions and is well documented. Now this is the work of Beck at the University of Pennsylvania. For example, and I mentioned David Burns, the fellow that I did the study with. He was at U of P at the same time. He also has done work in this area, quite a bit of work. The difficulty of challenging or disputing these thoughts and therefore modifying both feelings and behavior is delineated by modern scientific cognitive behavior psychotherapy. So what we have here is that there are going to be a series of irrational thoughts that people have, and these have been empirically found, and that these thoughts are going to be associated with certain what we call dysfunctional emotions, and that you can begin to challenge these thought processes and what we call restructure them so that you begin to think clearly and then have more functional emotions and more functional relationships with people. So let me use the example that I just gave, okay? Emotional reasoning. I feel that this person doesn't like me. How do you know? Because I feel it. All right? Where's the evidence? Is there any other way of looking at it? Is it as bad as it seems? When you begin to go through this restructuring process, you begin to break down that cognitive distortion, called, in this case, emotional reasoning. And by breaking it down, you begin to think of things more clearly around you. It's sort of like these automatic thoughts that are dysfunctional. If you want an example, would be like a set of glasses. If I have clear glasses on, like these, but these are reading glasses, but if I have a set of glasses on, and the glasses are colored, let's say, yellow, then everything around me is sort of like, yellow means what? Caution. I sort of filter everything around me that I'm seeing through the lens of being cautious. On the other hand, if I have a blue-colored lens, then we know blue, feeling the blues down. Red-colored lens, anxiety. Red, stop. So there are certain types of distortions that are related to each of these emotions. And by cognitively challenging them, what we end up doing is we end up both changing our emotional reaction and then we change our behavioral reaction. Because if we have a more functional, emotional reaction to things that are around us, then we can behave appropriately to those around us, whether they be members of our family, our husbands, our wives, our children, people who are friends, our colleagues, and so on, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how does this fit in with what we said before? It fits in because if you remember, in terms of healing in the church, you have the notion that we have the spiritual healing, the mystical, the holy mysteries of the church, and at the same time, we use the gifts that God has given us. And that's why I brought in science here. The gifts that God has given us to understand how we function. Because the research has shown that these dysfunctional automatic thoughts trigger dysfunctional emotions, which trigger really dysfunctional behavior. So dysfunctional thoughts, dysfunctional emotions, dysfunctional behavior. So what we try to do then is to intervene with the thought process. That changes the emotional process. That then changes our behavioral response to others. Is this easy? No, it's not. Because you have to be constantly aware, just like in our spiritual life. We have to be aware the devil is constantly there, trying to get at us. So what we have, because we're inclined toward this brokenness, we're inclined to, it's very easy to have emotional reasoning. It's so easy to think, oh, I'll never get better, okay? That's all or nothing reasoning, okay? It's a whole list of things that we can get to at some point. But and you begin to challenge these things step by step, and that enhances our function. Are there any questions at this point? Michael?
Are we not born with cognitive thinking anyway?
Are we born
Are we
with what?
born with cognitive thinking?
We're born with cognitive, yes, we're born,
Okay.
but we're also born with just distorted thinking,
All right.
okay? We're born with irrationality is sort of, Albert Ellis talks about this. Irrationality is sort of like built into our cognitive system, okay? You meet me in the hallway, and you say, hello, Father, and I go by you, and you say to yourself, oh boy, he doesn't like me, what's wrong, So you've drew a conclusion unwarranted from the facts. We call that arbitrary inference, okay? Where's the evidence of that I don't like you? What's another way of looking at it?
Maybe you were preoccupied.
Huh?
Maybe you were preoccupied.
Maybe I was preoccupied. Maybe I just got an emergency phone call. Maybe my mind was so on something else. Maybe it has nothing to do with me not paying attention to you. Exactly right. So what we have to do then is, it's so natural for us to draw a conclusion unwarranted from the facts and personalize. Okay, I'm really, really jumping way ahead here. It's so easy to do that. Okay, when something happens in general, you say it's related to me. A waiter doesn't come over to your table right away to serve you. Oh, look at that. What, about something wrong with me? What's up? It's so easy to personalize something. And that's our broken tendency that we have. So what we have to do is to begin to learn to intervene with our own, distorted automatic thoughts. Now, the three that I gave you here at the end, which we'll not get to today, but we'll get to at some point, the three are the major ones that we have found in marital relationships: entitlement, reciprocity, and nagging, and so on. Okay. But the ones I just gave you are just in general itself. But nevertheless, when we find people who become dysfunctional in some way, either they become angry or anxious or depressed or whatever, it's always because there's some type of distorted automatic thought that they have, that they're just assuming is correct in some way or other, okay? Any questions or any other questions? Now, the two I call them stanchions of irrationality are demanding expectations and over-evaluation of consequences. So, underneath all automatic thoughts are these two major, I call them stanchions or pillars, so to speak. Demanding expectations of self, others, or situations. If you find yourself ever using the word must, or should, or have to, or ought, and very often, not only do you do this with yourself, now this is marriage-oriented, but you do it with your spouse or your children, and that's where we'll get into entitlement and reciprocity, and you'll see the relationship in a moment, okay? But this is across the board. In any dysfunctionality, psychological dysfunctionality, there is this one major stanchion. You know, demanding expectations of self, I should, I must, I have to, I ought of, whatever. And over-evaluations. Whatever it was, or whatever it is, or whatever was not done is terrible, awful, end of the world, or more than 100% bad in some way or another. And it's so automatic that you don't even think about it. It's right there, okay? Now, speaking of studies, there's a whole new set of studies that have been done that show that the parts of the brain, we call it the neuropsychology of cognition. That's the general area that it is, that this falls under. And we found that there are certain parts of the brain that seem to be connected to one another and always seem to be, and I'm going to use an analogy here, like Christmas lights. They always seem to be turned on in a dim way, so that if something happens, they flip on right away. And they seem to be connected to different parts of the brain that produce some of these emotions. So there's a tendency that we have when some information comes in, there's a tendency to light up this network of associations that you might say, personalizing me, they're attacking me, or something like that. And what we have to do is to begin from the psychological viewpoint, break down those connections. And those are those challenging questions that I mentioned before, okay? So you have demanding expectations and over-evaluations. Can anyone give any examples of these, maybe? Sorry?
I have a question.
Sure.
It's not good to have expectations for your parents, or yourself.
Good question. I want to see if I cover this in the next slide. Let me see.
Father, can you
Let me
repeat the
answer.
question? Father?
Let me answer that question.
Is
And
it negative? I said, is it negative to have expectations?
to make a demanding expectation is not good. To have preferences, would likes, is good. I would like you to. All right? You know, there's a big difference. You should be doing this because. That's what we'll get to with those three unholy things, okay? You must, and you know, it's a must, a shouldhood, a have to, an ought. Very different than saying, I would prefer, I would like. Because along with the demand and expectation is that if you over-evaluate, as soon as you make a demand on something, you tend to over-evaluate the outcome. It's more than 100% because you should do it. It's terrible and awful that you don't do it. So you make it 100% bad. When I do this clinically with a patient, well, I haven't done it in a while, but is to create what we call a mental ruler, okay? Call it the mental ruler technique. It's a little technique that someone could use. What is the most pleasant thing you could think of in the entire universe? Most pleasant. Give me a concrete, something very, very concrete now.
Children.
Yeah, my family.
That's not concrete, that's general. Unless you put your family someplace. I want something really concrete. Huh?
Faith in God.
Faith in God, too abstract. I want something concrete, specific. Give me, make believe you're a Hollywood screenwriter. Give me the setting.
A setting, is that what you're looking for?
Perfect couple program.
Huh?
Heaven.
It's too abstract.
Children.
Kids success, parents success.
Having dinner at the table every Thursday.
What table?
Having family dinner every once a week.
Having family dinner once a week, and you could picture, for example, being at your dining room table. You could picture the room that you're in. You could picture the artwork that might be around it, and so on. Okay, that's not too bad. I also, sometimes I would have to feed this to one of my patients, and I'd say, well, picture that you're sitting on a beach in Hawaii with a cocktail in your hand, sitting in a lounge chair, underneath a palm tree with a cool breeze, okay, and you could hear the waves coming in, and you could see them, and so on. See, I wanted something very, 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 very concrete.
And no children.
And no children around. Okay, and no children around. Now that's zero. That's zero, okay? Now we're going to make 0 to making a mental ruler. We're making a mental ruler up here, okay? Now, the 100 end of the ruler, top end of the ruler, what's the worst possible thing you could possibly picture in the entire universe? Concrete, once again.
Sitting in a small room with hundreds of kids.
Sitting in a small room with hundreds of kids, right?
Something was really dear to me, like very ill or some bad situation. That's the
Say again.
word. Someone being ill, sick,
Someone ill or sick.
and
All right, but we'd have to have a good picture of them ill or sick.
us.
We'd have to picture them maybe on life support, maybe with machines going on all around, maybe with drool coming out of their mouth, I'm very serious.
Right, very sick.
With drool coming out of their mouth, okay? One that I found effective with my patients was in Indochina, around the time of the Vietnam War. There was this medical doctor that crossed the authorities there, and they wanted to kill him, but they didn't want to kill him right away. So what they did was that they put him in the middle of a sort of a jungle field that was filled with, all kinds of red ants and so on and so forth. Staked him out with his arms and legs staked out, and just without food and water on his stomach, and just left him there. And when he wasn't dying quick enough, even though he didn't have food and water, they would take a pair of chopsticks, put them in his ears, and every day hammered in a little bit into his ear. Right? That's 100. So now we have sitting on a beach, okay, and we have the 100. Okay? So now, let's go back. Someone does not do what you must think that they did. If you say must, have to, ought, and it's terrible and awful, is it more than chopsticks in the ears? You just got it a little bit. You just began to restructure your own thinking process. Right? You're now applying a mental ruler to an event, either something that occurred or did not occur. okay? If someone said something, let's say, we talked about 4-letter words before. Let's say your child comes out and says, Mom, you, or something. Now, you could probably say to yourself, that, whatever. You could do a real must to do on that one, okay? Or a must not to do. And you could say, this is really the end of the world. You could do that. And this goes into Parenting 101. I'm jumping really, really ahead. I don't even have the slides for that one for you yet. But if you think about it, how effective would you be as a parent when you go overboard? You're not going to be effective. So what we want to do is to use the most effective technique not to get the child to use something like that, which means you have to have emotional stability, which means you have to be thinking clearly, which means you have to go from musts, have-tos, oughts to prefers, and begin to apply the mental ruler and say, yeah, that's just a 50%. I don't want my child to use words like that. What can I do to get my child to be most effective not to do something like that? Now you can apply that to a husband and wife in terms of their interactions with one another. And that's this part that we'll get to probably next time we meet. And we can apply that to almost anything, any engagement with anyone in some way or other, okay? Does that sort of make sense now a little bit? Okay, all right. Now these are the a little more technical terms for the cognitive distortions. Selective abstraction, focusing on one event while excluding others. I would really note these to you. I hope you're going to keep these sheets, but we're going to come back to this very often over the next few sessions, all right? Arbitrary inference, that's the example I used before about meeting Michael in the hallway, okay, and he didn't, I didn't acknowledge him, okay? Drawing a conclusion unwarranted by the facts in an ambiguous situation. It's ambiguous because there could be any number of things that could be happening here, but you're selectively focusing on one thing. You say you're drawing a conclusion, Father doesn't like me, or something like that. Okay, and think of how you could apply this in your life. Think of all the times that you may have arbitrarily inferred something in some way. Because situations have multiple interpretations, multiple meanings, especially when there are different people involved, okay? Personalization, blaming yourself for an event you are not responsible for. Or thinking that you are responsible for some event that you're not responsible for, okay? Polarization, perceiving or interpreting events in all or nothing terms. A good example here, let me make it something family oriented. A child shows you their report card, and they show you that they got, let's say, 4 A's out of 4 courses. Oh, that's great, okay? 4 A's and a B. That's great, okay? 4 A's and 2 B's. You're stupid. Look, what kind of a kid are you? So either you're brilliant or you're stupid. You tend to polarize, okay? You don't see things, and 1 less B is simply 1 less B than what it was before. You tend to see things either in all or nothing terms. You want to give an example? I do that all the time. There's no middle ground, right, okay. And this is something that you can, remember now, you're enlivened by Christ to do this. Not only is this good science, behavioral science, but it's also, you're enlivened by, that's why I started off with the theological aspect of this, all right?
It's really confusing for the kids because they feel like they're disappointing all the time, and it's not the case.
Yes, exactly, it's this, you hit the nail, that's very, very important, very important. Yes, it's very disappointing. Here the child comes to you and shows you their report card. Gee, Mom, and here's a good, okay. Gee, Mom, look at this. I got an A on my report card. Let's say the child has something on their face, okay? This was a training tape I used for my graduate students. This is where I'm getting this example from, okay? Wipe your mouth. So here the child is so proud to show their report card to the parent singles out that they have, you know. Do you think the child would be more likely or less likely to show their report card to their parent in the future? Less likely. Exactly. So you see, you have a whole cascade of really not very good things happening and so on, okay? Anyone want to come up with any other examples or anything? Oh, yeah. And here are the others. Generalization, the tendency to see things in always or never categories. It'll never get better. Gee, our marriage isn't working. It'll never get better. My child isn't doing at school. They'll never do better, etc., etc., etc. It's always or never. We'll put an always or never tag on something that is going on around you. And we put that label right there. Okay? Demanding expectations, I sort of explained that before. Beliefs there are laws or rules that have to be obeyed. Should, must, have to's, oughts. Not preferred. Preferred is wonderful. I prefer, I would like. This is what our Lord himself did. To spiritualize this for a moment. The rich young man who came to our Lord. What do I have to do to attain the kingdom of heaven? Okay? You should, you must, you have. Our Lord didn't do that. He said, "Go sell what thou hast, give to the poor, come follow me." Does that sound harsh or gentle? It sounds gentle. All right? Our Lord had a preference for all of us. He didn't make any demands. He had preferences. Okay? Anyway, it's getting late. We'll finish this up. That's okay. All right. And catastrophizing, that's sort of what this is really Beck's list here, and I extracted the two major ones before, the stanchions I call them, and this is more of Beck's list, okay? And then emotional reasoning, the judgment that one is feelings that are facts. Now here are the disputational questions or challenging questions. This is the nuts and bolts of cognitive intervention. Cognitive behavioral intervention. Where is the evidence, either for or against the idea of thought? Now, what we usually do with a patient is we have them write down, give them a piece of paper with various columns. In column 1, they can put the situation that they're in. I'll give you the full set here for a moment. You give them the situation they're in. I'm at home in the kitchen. Okay, what is the event that happened? My child called me a four-letter word. Okay? Okay. Now, what is your level of feeling? I feel really angry, 100% angry. What did you say to yourself? They shouldn't be talking to their mother or their father that way. This is terrible, it's awful, it's the end of the world, how could they do this? We'll get into that later on also. And now you ask these questions, okay? Where's the evidence? Is there any other way of looking at it? Any alternative explanations? All right, it's not the greatest thing what the child said, but is it really more than 100% bad? All right, that mental ruler technique. All right? And what is the effect of holding on to my distorted thoughts? After you see that it's not as bad as it seems, what's the effect of holding on to my distorted thoughts? So if I'm angry, how effective am I as a husband, as a wife, as a father, as a mother, as a friend, as a boss, as an employee, as anybody? How effective are you when you get angry? Let me just jump ahead one moment here again, just to make this meaningful. Very often I would talk to children, and many times the parent would be on target in terms of the child's behavior. The child would be doing something that would be inappropriate. And I would always interview a parent first before talking to the child. And then I would talk to the child. And then in talking to the child, I would say, okay, and we begin to talk about it. Invariably, the child focuses not on their behavior. One of the first things that comes out of the child's mouth is how mean or nasty their mother or father was at talking to them. So whatever the parent is trying to get across to the child is going nowhere. Because the child is cognitively focusing on the way it was said. In fact, it was a study that was done at Harvard University. It goes back now a number of years, by Roger Brown. And he did it on another high-level, highfalutin word, the pragmatics of speech. Meaning, what is the real content of what is being said? So, is it the words themselves, or is it the way that the words are used? I'll give you an example. Someone comes in and you say, sit down. If you were to transcribe that on a piece of paper, you would see the words sit and down. Any problem? Sit down! You were to transcribe that on a piece of paper. If you were to transcribe that on a sheet of paper, you would see just simply the word sit. You would see simply sit down, right? But that's not the meaning, is it? The meaning is in what? The way it was said. In fact, Roger Brown found that between 90 to 95% of the meaning in any communication is in the way something is said. The pragmatics of speech. So I think I have this in a slide coming up, and I'm jumping ahead here, but it's a good place to end. So, following the words of Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly but carry a big stick. Let me see what comes up, because we're just about ready. This is a good place to end. We'll end here. Yes, we'll end here. All right. Are there any general questions before we end? So then, Alex, you'll set the next date, I guess, January, March, April, May, I guess, or sometime? Or
Yeah. I'll email you and see what works for your schedule. We'll figure it out.
Huh?